Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki. Welcome to the 555th Imagine Greater Buffalo program and our 177th Imagine Buffalo YouTube program hosted by our wonderful Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thank you for joining us today. This program is created by the Center for the Study of Art, Architecture, History, and Nature, or C-SAAHN, as I like to pronounce the acronym, and imaginelifelonglearning.com. Before we get started, just a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted and your video turned off. If you have a question or comment, please type it into the chat box and we'll go through them at the end of the presentation as time allows. We are recording this program so you can watch it again later on the Downtown Central Library's Facebook page and their YouTube channel. And please, we hope you share the link with others. Now on to our featured speaker. Joining us today is Christina Orsi, president of the John R. Oishei Foundation. Christina Orsi is responsible for guiding the long-term strategic direction of the foundation, supporting and empowering the staff to work with communities, change systems, and build financial prosperity for a racially just, vibrant Buffalo Niagara region. Christina has over 30 years of experience in leading organizations and initiatives that have improved our region. She has been a catalyst for driving innovation and entrepreneurial advances and instrumental in designing and launching new development initiatives, forging sustainable partnerships, and stewarding billions of dollars in revitalization funds to the area. Christina has had a deep involvement in the community, working with diverse stakeholders, including the nonprofit sector, business, government, education, and community organizations, and is driven by purpose and a mission to transform the region into one where everyone can thrive. So let's give a warm welcome to Christina Orsi. Christina, take it away.
Hi, thank you, Dennis, and thank you so much for having me today. Really appreciate it. You can see my presentation okay?
No.
No?
No.
Okay, let me share to make sure.
It worked just a minute ago, so we know it works.
You're getting it? Okay now, but you have the wrong view, right?
No, we have the right one. This is good.
You have the right view. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that glitch.
No.
Thanks again for having me. And today I wanted to give you an overview of the John R. Oishei Foundation, and in particular, a bit of insight into some major strategic shifts we made in the past couple of years, and why, and how I hope that they will contribute towards advancing our region. So just a real quick history on the foundation, if you're not familiar with it. It is actually named after our founder, John R. Oishei. He was a local industrialist and philanthropist who founded Trico Products. They are known in Buffalo for the company that actually brought the windshield wiper blade to the market back in the early 1900s. And through his business growth, he was a very generous person, and he set up a foundation originally in 1940 as a family foundation, and then in 1997 it became a private independent foundation named after him. And I have the privilege of serving as the president of that foundation. And really, Mr. Oishei only left guidance that he wanted the resources to be spent in the Western New York area to improve the quality of life. And so we have been stewarding his resources to do that in our community since. Our mission is to work with communities to change systems and build financial prosperity for a racially just, vibrant Buffalo Niagara region. And this is really a fairly new mission to us. About 2 years ago, when I joined the organization, we began a journey of stepping back and looking at the work that we've done and what our needs were in the community, and asking ourselves some questions about, is there a way we could make a more significant and longer term transformational contribution towards our community's well-being? And we really asked if our impact, despite all of the resources we've given to many nonprofits over decades that were doing a lot of really good work in the region, and at a time when our region was celebrating so much economic growth and revitalization, from waterfront to the Buffalo Niagara Medical Campus redevelopment and entrepreneurship, at the same time, I think we recognized that there were really deep economic injustices and disparities that persisted in our region. And we really started asking ourselves why, and what might we need to do different to help address some of that. Because, the reality is that Buffalo, while we have many things to celebrate and lots of economic growth, we are still one of the poorest and one of the most segregated cities in the country. The reality here is that our Black community members and residents earn 40% less, die 10 years sooner, and own their homes 1/3 less often than white people in our community. So we see significant and persistent disparities. When we did a survey of community members, largely from the east side of Buffalo, and asked them what were their most pressing issues that they faced, they said financial hardship, housing, transportation, jobs and employment. You can see the list here. And then we asked, what were the causes? And it really came down to unavailability or barriers to accessing good paying jobs and employment, lack of access to the training and education that they needed to get into that good paying employment, and inadequate social and networks and supports. And so through this and a whole bunch more analysis, we really did over 1.5 years community insights, data research and analysis to understand the disparities that exist and persist in our region. We really came to some conclusions that it was time that we needed to narrow our focus and really make some significant changes ourselves in how we go about supporting growth in a more equitable way across our region. And so we decided to narrow our focus and believe that over time it'll actually broaden the impact in our region. And we're narrowing our focus by setting a universal goal, which is financial prosperity for all, everyone in our region, not just some. And what we really see is, in many ways, we have folks who are thriving and others that are barely surviving. And we believe this can be best achieved by having really targeted approach by starting on the east side with Black residents, in centering them in understanding what the real barriers are to having them achieve and participate in financial prosperity throughout our region. This is also going to require us to really get at the root causes of the challenges. So thinking about shifting from immediate support, which certainly is still needed, but won't ultimately address the disparities that exist. So we're really looking at moving what we call upstream, and that is, moving from sort of treating a symptom today, handing out food, immediate, urgent shelter, to what is the root cause that contributed towards a person not being able to have the financial stability to afford quality, affordable housing and access to nutrition in the food that they need. And so that's when we talk about getting at the root cause and understanding there are really systems at play that have been the reason that we see these persistent disparities and that have to change if we really want lasting change. So going forward in our strategic pillar, we have 5 key focus areas that'll frame how we really work going forward in our community. The first is really understanding the inequities, the racial inequities, and therefore centering racial equity in everything that we do. And this means, you know, in how we disperse funds to how we form strategic partnerships to how we are organized internally. But really centering racial equity to ensure that we aren't inadvertently contributing towards exasperating further inequities that exist. That also necessitates that we really become a learning organization, and particularly that we are learning from community members that we hope to most impact. They really understand better than anyone the barriers that are preventing them from succeeding, and also the solutions that need to be put in place to help them thrive. And so we're committed to consistently learning with and from a community to inform and guide our work. That also means we're looking at doing our work different by building, sharing, and using power. The reality is, as a foundation with significant resources and connectivity in our region, we do carry some influence. And how we use that matters, not only in how we grant money, but do we actually help those in the community and community-based organizations build their own capability, influence, and power so that they can lead the change in their neighborhoods? Are we sharing decision-making with residents who are most affected by wealth disparities and co-creating strategic initiatives and outcomes and progress? And are we building bridges across the divisions in our community so that we really bring people together regardless of socioeconomic status and racial differences to have a shared unity around financial prosperity for all? I already talked about we really are going to move to look at addressing the systems change to get at root causes. So this means we're going to be looking at, you know, policy changes and playing a role in supporting community-based advocacy work, grassroots mobilization, public education campaigns, to shift policies that'll help close the gap between this stark wealth gap that we see in our community. And also reinvesting in local community-based organizations, leadership development, again, so that they can really design, control, and lead the development of their own neighborhoods. And then we're looking at how can we leverage all of our financial resources. Certainly historically, we have been a foundation that grants money every year, and we'll continue to do that. But beyond grant making, we can also support the development of nonprofit organizations. We can support the development of leaders, of coalitions. I talked about using our influence and power, and we can use our investment portfolio to invest in our own community in ways that'll advance our mission. So we're really looking at how we leverage all of our resources beyond grant making towards our new mission and focus. And ultimately, our vision is that we have a thriving, prosperous community for everyone, where diversity really is our strength. But we're going to start by focusing on the East Side, where we see not only very stark disparities, but also one of the greatest opportunities in our region, because the East Side of Buffalo makes up 30% of our residents, 40% of our land mass in the city of Buffalo, and has thousands of people who are looking for better opportunities in jobs and entrepreneurship and housing and neighborhood development. So thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about where we're headed. We really do believe that in focusing in this way, it's going to benefit everyone. And there was actually a study done a number of years ago on if in the Buffalo region we close the wealth gap between Black and brown communities and white communities, we will all benefit more. In fact, we'll have more than $1 billion in regional GDP created each year by just closing the gap that we see in education and job readiness. We would have increased employment of more than 54,000 people if we close the gap in the criminal justice system. More than 36,000 additional families buying homes by closing the gap in equity around neighborhood and home ownership disparities. And overall, more than $12 billion circulating in our economy in wealth for local families if we close the income and wealth gap. So we will all benefit when we're able to close the gaps that exist. What's next for us? We announced this new strategic direction and mission for us just over a year ago. Since then, we've been going through a very significant organizational change to realign our capabilities and processes towards this new mission, spending a lot of time in the community, listening and learning so that they can guide the development of our new strategic initiatives. And early next year, we'll be announcing within our new focus area what some of our community-based new strategic initiatives will be. And so we hope that many people will join us because we know no one organization can make these kind of shifts and outcomes that we hope to see. So we're really trying to build bridges with many other partners so that we can all collectively build a great foundation in our community to advance racial equity. And here's where you can follow us and learn more about the Oishei Foundation. Thank you so much for your time and interest today.
Well, Christina, thank you very much for a very concise review of a couple of years' effort suddenly gets summarized in 15 minutes or so. Where do we begin? I guess my first question, the Community Foundation, Greater Buffalo, has a racial equity roundtable. It started with a pretty important grant from the Kellogg Foundation, as I recall. We were one of very few recipients of that Kellogg grant, and they've been laboring certainly in the same direction that it sounds like you are. Can you describe how you interact with them and any other key players?
Absolutely.
There's ways to make partnerships with everybody, but let's just focus on a couple of the big ones that you might be working with.
Yes. So I'm actually a founding member of the Racial Equity Roundtable. Now, I think 10 years. And I would say, honestly, that's where my deep understanding around racial equity and the disparities began. It was through having the opportunity to be a member of that roundtable and really understand why the disparities exist and what needs to change. And through that ongoing work with the Racial Equity Roundtable, in fact, the report that I highlighted at the end that showed if we close those wealth gaps, how we'll all benefit, that was actually the Racial Equity Roundtable's data and analysis. So I continue to be an active and engaged member, and there's lots of opportunities for collaboration. And I would say the work done at that roundtable has very much informed our work and our new strategic direction.
Good. That's a good collaboration. All right, we've got a good audience. Perhaps let's see what types of questions we have from that audience. Hello. Melissa or Sean? There you are. Or Hazel.
Hi. So we've got a few. People are really feeling it today. So our first question comes from viewer Deborah. Deborah writes, how does the built environment of the city contribute to the economic divides? And how can we change that environment?
Oh, that's such a great question. We would have to go through a lot of history, but I'll try to summarize. So really, historically, decisions like redlining, if you're familiar with that, but basically when the federal government put in, the way that mortgages were backed by the government, they put in place a practice called redlining, which essentially on maps, they drew red lines around areas that were not good for banks to lend in. And those were primarily Black communities, predominantly Black communities. So in our community, if you were actually to look at those red line maps back from like the 1930s, you would almost exclusively see the east side of Buffalo. So literally they said to banks, don't lend for houses, mortgages in those areas. So that began some of the inequities around home ownership and where who could get access to a mortgage in what neighborhoods, right? Because largely there was a whole community left out of being able to access mortgages to purchase homes in areas like the east side of Buffalo. And you saw this all over communities in the US. In addition, the federal government, when they did make a major investment in neighborhood development, like major housing and public housing, they intentionally segregated the public housing. And they generally built higher quality public housing for white people in better areas. So you look at like the public housing historically that was built on Buffalo's waterfront, that was designated largely as white, versus public housing that was built on the east side, which was generally built substandard and again was intentionally segregated by our government. So there was, and then you had infrastructure that was built. Of course, we're living it today with, you know, the discussion around the removal of the 33. But the reality is there were investments made in infrastructure, and an investment like the 33 was made, you know, when you started to see the growth of suburbs, frankly, to allow people who were now working in the city but living in suburbs to get in and out of the city. That's why those highways were built. But a decision was made to build it through a predominantly Black neighborhood that split the neighborhood in two and devalued it. So there are a whole bunch. None of this happened on accident. There were decisions after decisions, largely government-made decisions, that absolutely have caused and contributed towards the segregation in our community that then also has contributed towards concentrated poverty. And then you also layer in today, still, you will see things like in various towns, there's exclusionary zoning. If a town doesn't allow multiple unit buildings, right? Some are very opposed to apartments or multi-unit buildings. You're excluding opportunities for potentially various socioeconomic individuals to move to different communities. And so we still see things like that exist today that continue to exacerbate the disparities. So there's a lot around how we built neighborhoods and how we've excluded who can be in what neighborhoods that contributes towards this wealth gap. You also overlay the fact that in our region, we have very, very limited public transportation, particularly out in the suburbs. But we have a lot of jobs and a lot of good paying jobs in the suburbs. But the most people on the east side rely on public transportation. How are you supposed to get to a good job in a suburb if there is not quality public transportation and you can't afford a car? So we're, again, further concentrating the disparities.
We have quite a few questions, so I'm going to hop to the next one. Thank you for that, Christina. Our next question is from a viewer who writes, what is your take on the food insecurity issue on the east side, especially regarding the Buffalo news story this morning?
Didn't see the Buffalo news story this morning, so you have to give me the headlines on it. Sorry about that. Haven't had a chance to read it yet.
But you can talk about.
But I can talk about the food disparities. Yeah. It's complicated. Fortunately, there's one of our partner organizations, the Western New York Foundation, who has shifted their focus fully to work on food systems. So again, I think part of it is a recognition we have to move beyond short-term food handouts, which I understand are necessary right now, but we really got to take a step back and look at the food systems. Why is it when we are in many ways a region of abundance from agriculture in our rural areas, not able to provide access to nutritional food in some of our urban areas? And so there's a lot going on, but again, I think one of the things that has to happen is that the community that where we see the largest disparities has to be part of the solutions. And I know there's like proposals to build, a food co-op on the east side. There's a number of urban gardens that are being developed and popping up on the east side. So I think it's much more complex than put another store on the east side. It's really looking at everything from production to access to can you develop nutritional healthy food options on the east side from producers, growers that are from the east side, and how can you connect that to our agricultural opportunities in the region? So there's a lot of really good work going on around really a broad coalition to address the food system challenges in our region, really led by the Western York Foundation.
I have another question here. I think this one will be great. Viewer Kathy writes, I know you said that early next year will be when you put some of this work into practice, but can you give a potential example of the type of grant you will be granting?
Yeah, so first of all, I would say don't think about grant making, and this is one of the shifts we're making. It's not going to be grant making in the traditional way that we did grant making, where someone applied for a grant, we took them through a process, got approval from our board, gave them the grant, asked them for a report. I think what we're going to be doing is co-designing strategic initiatives that get at the systems change with community members, and then looking for partners who can help collaborate and build a coalition to advance those systems change. Certainly, we'll probably be granting some of those partners money, but we'll be doing a lot more than that. And so it's going to look very differently. Right now, we haven't made any decisions on the strategic initiatives, but one of the top challenges that keeps coming up is access to affordable, stable housing. So we're having a lot more detailed discussions around, is there a role we could play with a number of community-based organizations to address the systemic barriers to affordable quality housing, which would honestly get us into everything from access to credit to financial systems to housing supply, to the cost of housing, to who controls the land where housing is built. So we're going to, I only say that because I think it won't be like it used to be, where we have an open application on our foundation website to come in for grants. It's really going to be around community-built strategic initiatives and partnerships.
I have another question here from a viewer. I think you have already covered some of this, but maybe there is room for more discussion from this question. Timothy writes, great overview. Congratulations on your visionary new mission, which has enormous potential to reduce inequalities in our community. Will you talk a bit more about approaches that you will take to create systems level change, which I agree will be critical to move toward equity?
Yeah. So I think a systems change at several levels. One is, and maybe one of the biggest lever you can pull is legislation. And I talked a little bit about how past, federal, state, and even today, local legislation directly caused and contributed towards the disparities that we see. So it could also directly contribute towards more equity. So I think some of it will be around helping develop policies and then advocating to get them implemented, probably more so at the state and local level. So that would be one area. And how can we support those who might already be working in that area, or help fund the research around what some of the policy changes are, and then coalition building, and then advocacy work. So that would be one area. The second is There also have been a lot of policies, legislation that have been put in place. I'll give you an example. You know, there was back in the 1960s, 70s, a Fair Housing Act put in place that was supposed to end discrimination in housing and lending. And so you had legislation put in place, but you don't always see the practices of institutions aligning with legislation. So that would be another area. How could we use our power and influence to help people really look at how their practices might be intentionally or often unintentionally causing and contributing towards greater disparities. And so an example of practices might be, you know, real estate agents guiding someone away from a particular neighborhood, right? Because it is seen as not a good neighborhood to live in. So that's a practice, right? Legally, you can't steer people. That's called steering, but those practices still happen. So is there a role for education, information to help organizations and associations change the way that they practice? So those are kind of two levers when you think about systems change that you can approach.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That wraps up all the questions I've received from viewers. Thank you again.
Jason, thank you. Christina, you've been focusing on the collaborations at our local level. And I keep thinking Rochester, Syracuse, Binghamton, you name it, in New York State must have very similar issues that they're dealing with. They just have to. How is their collaboration at the state level? Yeah, the federal government does its thing, but just on the state, so that best practices get observed and communicated.
Yeah.
And I'll cite one that's troubled me. I've heard, or the case has been made, that Rochester was redoing its highway system in the city and filled it in. Reasonable cost, no caps, no anything, made a parkway from what I understand. And the community benefited from that, much more reasonably priced than capping it. And yet I didn't hear that conversation going on to even discuss, well, what are the benefits? Why did it work there? And we're going to do what we have to do without judging either one. I'm just saying, is that discussion going on? So if something works in Binghamton, we hear about it. If something works in Syracuse, we incorporate it as well. If something works in Buffalo, we share it with them also. So does that exist in a structured way?
Yes, to some degree. It does. There is a organization called the New York Funders Alliance, which is an alliance of other organizations like ours all across the state. And in fact, they just had their annual conference here. And there was a lot of discussion around how can we collaborate more, particularly on statewide issues for advancing policy changes and building coalitions. So that's one table where we come together. And then at least I would say I probably interact the most with Rochester and then Syracuse, but there's also another organization that's called the Asset Funders Network, which again is all people who are providing some kind of funding to help contribute towards closing this wealth gap. And so through that, like we've been learning a lot in Rochester, a major credit union, ESL, just announced that they're going to focus on a huge home ownership to try to close the gap between Black and white home ownership in the Rochester, Monroe County. So absolutely, we're learning from them. What are you doing that maybe could be applicable here? And then they learn, what we're doing. But I think if we're going to talk about any kind of state changes, we have to work across the state as a coalition.
Yeah, that's good. And Oishei then could act as a facilitator, perhaps, for not just having a once in a while gathering of that with Zoom, with everything else. There's plenty of chances to be creative in our coordination of that at both ends, below us and above us, so to speak,
Yeah.
city-wise. Well, one of the sad parts of Buffalo is that the Oishei is one of the few corporate foundations that our ancestors left behind. And you realize the power of these things in other cities like Cleveland or Pittsburgh.
Detroit.
We have many headquartered companies that left foundations. We didn't think a lot about legacy, so hats off to Mr. Oishei and a great example that he set. And now we're seeing it in the Wilson Foundation,
Yeah.
obviously, and more there is that. But boy, that's part of the struggle for Buffalo, in my estimation. It's folks weren't thinking legacy beyond their own lifetime, and we can only encourage that thought for others now through the community foundation, especially because that's what it's designed to do, is help people design those legacy dollar investments in what people cherish themselves. So we will leave it there. Thank you very much, Christina, and thank again the Oishei folks, and we hope to keep in touch with you so we can continue this dialogue.
Great.
And folks, thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll return next week, the 19th on Zoom, where we'll be joined by Anthony Bottino and Barbara Irwin. Now, they're authors of Creating Reading Rainbow, the untold story of a beloved children's series. The little notice ahead of time here, they will be featured in Buffalo Day for next year. That'll be in week 4. And the theme I will mention is around the future of American democracy. And for Buffalo Day, we add depends on lifelong learning. And it starts with children and it goes right through to seniors. And everybody, if we're going to solve a lot of these problems, folks, we've got to have honest discussions about what the problems are, some awareness how we got here, and certainly some creativity in how we move beyond them, and incorporate as many people in that listening and doing type of process. So let's hope to see you next week. I'm Dennis Galucki. Be well and good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christina.